Welcome to today's webinar where we will be discussing TN visa requirements, eligibility, and challenges with the TN visa under the USMCA as it applies to both Canadian and Mexican citizens. My name is Jeremy Richards, an attorney with Richards and Jerusik Immigration Law, where we solely practice U.S. immigration law. And a major part of our practice is dealing with individuals under the USMCA and helping them work and live in the United States under TN status and the challenges that come along with working in the United States and obtaining TN status. So today we will be discussing specifically what the TN visa is, what professions qualify for TN visa status, the qualifications for a TN visa, some of the professions that are problematic under the professions list, what the application process looks like. Now, it varies depending on whether or not you are Canadian or a Mexican citizen. Some of the common challenges that individuals face with the TN visa application process, some tips in this process, as well as some generally answered questions about TN visas that we receive on a regular basis. So what is the TN visa? So the TN visa, first of all, it's only for citizens of Canada and Mexico. Canadian and Mexican permanent residents do not qualify for TN status. And it falls under what is called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which was adopted in 2020. It was formerly NAFTA, and that's what a lot of individuals still refer to it as NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. And actually at the border, it's called a Treaty NAFTA visa still, and that's what TN stands for, is Treaty NAFTA under the NAFTA agreement. But it's now officially called the USMCA. And what is the purpose of the TN visa? Well, it was created to ease the transfer of employees between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, to allow certain professionals that they have identified to be able to work in the countries on a more fluid basis. And we'll go over that, how much easier the TN visa is to obtain in relation to other visas such as the H-1B visa, which most individuals throughout the world have to go through the H-1B visa process. Canadians and Mexicans have the advantage of the TN visa. So what are the benefits of a TN visa? Well, one of the biggest benefits is it's very quick to get, especially if you are a Canadian citizen. You can simply show up at a port of entry, apply, and if you have all your paperwork in order, within 30 minutes, you can have TN status and be working in the United States. Another advantage is there is no lottery or annual cap on the amount of TN visas that are issued. If you're familiar with the H-1B visa, there is a lottery ran every year, and if you're lucky enough to get in the lottery, there are a total of 85,000 visas that are available for the H-1B visa. If you're one of the lucky individuals, and right now the odds are about 10% to get an H-1B visa, then you could officially request an H-1B visa. Not the same with the TN. As many individuals from Mexico or Canada that want to get TN status throughout the year can do so, and they can apply immediately without entering a lottery. It also has unlimited extensions. So TN status can be issued for a time period of 1 day up to 3 years per issuance of the visa, and an extension can be sought every 3 years indefinitely. And TN visa also still carries the ability to obtain a green card either through family or through employment, just like an H-1B visa does. And it is a little more complicated during some steps of the process, but the ability to go from a TN visa to a green card is exactly the same as an H-1B visa to a green card. And there's a wide range of qualifying professions for TN status as well. And if you are under one of those professions, then you could be eligible to work in the United States under TN status. So what are the professions? Well, there are 63 professions specifically listed on the list, and they're divided. When you look at the USMCA professions list, they're divided in different categories. and it can be a little bit confusing. It's divided into general professions, medical professions, science professions, and teaching professions. But when you calculate them all, there's 63 total professions in there, divided in those categories. It is not an open work. It is only for the designated professions. So you can't come and work in whatever profession you want in the United States under TN status. And here's a list of some of the common ones: accountants, computer systems analysts, engineers, lawyers, management consultants, and the list goes on. And that detailed list is found under Appendix 1603 D1 under the USMCA, where you can find all of those qualifying professions. And if your profession is not on that list, it probably doesn't qualify. And it depends. I was talking to an individual this morning, actually, on a consultation, trying to determine whether or not their profession fit under the list. And it comes down to the duties in the end, because a lot of individuals or employers, you may have a job title that isn't specifically listed, but when you look at the duties that you're performing on a daily basis, those duties may be consistent with one of the professions. And it's not a title necessarily that qualifies you or defines what you are doing. It's what is your degree? What are your duties? What is your actual profession? So just because your title doesn't match doesn't necessarily mean that what you're doing doesn't fit under one of these professions. So what are the requirements for TN status? Well, first, you have to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico, so no permanent residents qualify. You have to have a job offer for a profession under the USMCA professions list. In general, if you're thinking about what professions do qualify, outside of the ones that are listed on the USMCA professions list, in general, managerial, marketing, and sales professions do not qualify for a TN visa. Those types of roles are often more fitting for an H-1B visa. And also, people get caught up in whether a profession is in demand in the United States. Just because something might be in demand or in short supply in the United States doesn't mean it qualifies for TN status either. So demand does not define whether or not a position is eligible. Also to note, trades don't qualify. So if you're working as an electrician, plumber, carpenter, welder, etc., those are not qualifying professions. Trades are protected in Canada, Mexico, as well as in the United States. You must have a U.S. job offer or a contract with a U.S. entity. And I divide that because if you are a Canadian company or a Mexican company, for example, and you have a contract that you're servicing in the United States, that qualifies to send an employee to the US to service that contract. On the other hand, if you're an individual, typically you're going to come to the United States because you have a job offer from a US entity. Now, this can't be for prospective work. So you can't say, hey, I want a TN because I potentially will be working in the United States as an engineer. No, you have to have an actual job offer, and the company that is making that job offer to you must have professional level work for you to perform in the United States. And we often run into issues with that when it's a placement agency, where you'll have IT consulting company, for example, and they'll hire a bunch of computer systems analysts with the intention of putting them to work as computer systems analysts, yet they do not have work for them to perform yet in the United States. That can be problematic if you're applying for a TN and this IT consulting company says they want you to work in the United States as a computer systems analyst, and then the border officer asks, well, let me see, can you prove what contract you're servicing? If they don't have a contract yet, you could be refused for TN status. So you have to have an offer for professional level work that is available. And if asked, you have to provide proof that that employment is available now. And you're actually going to service a contract or actually perform those professional level duties upon entry in TN status. Now, Self-employment is not allowed under a TN. So you can't come to the United States, open up shop, and start soliciting contracts and doing work in the United States as an individual. Self-employment is not allowed. Now, that said, there is an exception. Let's suppose, again, we'll go back to IT industry. Let's say you are an IT individual working out of Canada or Mexico, and you have your own IT company, and you could be a solo individual doing this. And you have entered into a contract with a US entity that qualifies. That is not considered self-employment. You would then be able to enter the United States under that contractual obligation to your US client and provide services to your US client under TN status. The TN would still be issued to you as an individual in that situation. They don't issue TNs for companies. So even though the contract is with your Canadian entity or your Mexican entity, they are sending you to the United States to service that contract for the US client, and you as the individual would obtain that TN status to do it. And again, this all has to be prearranged. You can't operate on hopes to get contracts or future work. If you get the TN visa, I'm going to get this job. No, you have to have the job offer ahead of time. Now, qualifications. Qualifications can be a little bit confusing under the USMCA. When you look at the appendix, it lists all the professions, and alongside all the professions, it lists the requirements. And there's a lot of and/or language in those requirements as well. So when you are looking at the list, and I'll give a few examples. If you look at accountant, for example, you must have a degree in accounting, be a licensed accountant, or a related degree. If you're a lawyer, you have to have a law degree or a license to practice law. If you're a computer systems analyst, you have to have a degree in computer science or a related field. Engineer, a degree in engineering or a closely related field. I think you get the picture. Although it doesn't state explicitly what the degree must be in, according to the list, they have provided clarification that if you are working in that certain profession, that the degree must be in that field or a closely related field. What is closely related? Well, we have a rule that unless your degree or courses that you took are at least 50% in that area of study, then it wouldn't be considered closely related. So the majority of your course load should be in that field to qualify for TN status in that under that profession. Now, when they're talking about qualifications, all degrees and diplomas or certificates should be in English. If they're not in English, you should have an English translation. And foreign degrees obtained outside of Canada, Mexico, or the United States must also be accompanied with a degree evaluation to show what their US degree equivalency is. And it can get a little bit tricky depending on where you earned your education. There are a lot of third country nationals in Canada, for example, that obtain their education in India, Pakistan, or other countries where they have 3-year degrees. You must have the exact foreign equivalents. You cannot combine your education and experience to equate to a 4-year degree, for example. The H-1B visa allows that, and it can be confusing. H-1B visa has different rules. Those same rules do not apply to the TN visa. So a 3-year degree is not a 4-year degree, and you cannot combine it with another certificate or experience to say it's a 4-year degree either. A 3-year degree also is not a diploma or a certificate. It doesn't qualify under that category either. When the USMCA talks about a certificate, they're talking about a 2-year degree that is earned from Mexico. When they're talking about a diploma, they're talking about a 2-year degree that is from the United States or Canada. These cannot, again, be from any other country outside of the United States. And if you have doubts about what your education equivalency is, then we would recommend getting an evaluation from a company that performs foreign degree evaluations. There are, however, certain professions under the USMCA professions list that do allow the combination of experience plus degree. They are, for example, management consultant. So, management consultant, you could qualify if you have a 4-year degree or higher in a related field to your consulting engagement, or you can qualify by having 5 years of experience as a consultant in that field, or 5 years of experience as a consultant. So you can qualify three separate ways: experience or education. Computer systems analyst, you can qualify either by having a 4-year degree or by having a diploma plus 3 years experience or a certificate plus 3 years experience. Again, that is probably one of the most confusing professions because of the certificates that you can obtain in the computer science fields. Certificates, again, are from Mexico and they're 2-year. Diplomas are from Canada and the United States and they're 2-year. All of those other certificates that you can earn through Microsoft or whoever it might be, those short courses, unfortunately, do not qualify you for TN status under the USMCA. Very outdated. And I know a lot of individuals in the computer science world don't necessarily have a degree. They operate on certificates and they operate on experience. But unfortunately, since the USMCA or NAFTA was implemented in the 90s, they haven't made a change to the professions or how you qualify under the professions. Another profession, for example, would be graphic designers. You can also use a diploma plus experience, hotel managers, and interior designers as well. So you need to pay attention to that professions list. Look at what the educational and or experience requirements are and pay close attention to make sure that your education and experience lines up with what the professions list says is acceptable. Now, if you are using experience in the profession that you're applying under does allow for experience, a resume or a LinkedIn profile is not proof of experience. That's self-attest. It's self-serving. You can say whatever you want on a resume or LinkedIn. There's nothing to validate what you're saying on there. And I think we've all seen instances where people have lied on resumes and been caught lying about what they put on a resume. The border will not accept your resume as proof of experience. Proof must be in the form of letters from previous employers. And anyone that has can attest to your duties and your position when you were at that former employer could present a former employer letter for you. And these letters must be very specific. It has to include the time of employment, so a specific date. So you started in 2010 and you worked till 2020. And what were your duties you performed? What was the position you held in the company? They will count the days to the day. So if you are, let's say, applying as a computer systems analyst and you're relying on a diploma plus 3 years experience, if you have 2.5 years experience, you fall short. If you have 2 years and 364 days of experience, you fall short. One day short could lead to a denial. So when you're relying on those experience letters, make sure they're written in enough specificity that the officer can determine that the work you were doing was under that profession. The time you were doing it meets the time requirement so that they don't refuse you on that note either. And it's funny because although a resume is not evidence, we had a client the other day who went to the border, and we typically don't include a resume because it's not evidence. But we will tell them to just carry it in a side folder or somewhere else in case the officer asks for it. And the officer insisted on the resume, or else they didn't want to make a decision. Well, why? Well, a lot of times, the officer wants to see your resume so they can verify that you have actually been working in this field as per your resume. And it's my opinion that officers will use resumes kind of as a lie detector test, or a LinkedIn profile as a lie detector test. So you need to be careful what is on your resume, even though it can't it is not evidence for proving your experience to qualify, but an officer can use what you put on a resume or what you put on a LinkedIn profile against you. If you put something on a LinkedIn profile, for example, this is a common one, an individual will say, "Hey, I am a management consultant." And then the border officer will pull up the individual's LinkedIn profile and it says vice president of sales. Well, vice president of sales is not a management consultant, and they could get you for misrepresentation, and they could pull your TN status or deny your application for TN status. So you need to make sure that everything is consistent in that regard, even though a resume is not official proof of your experience. And the final thing is intent. I think it's widely known that a TN is a non-immigrant visa, and it's a temporary visa, and it's a single intent visa. Now, this part can be very confusing when it comes to TN status. Intent is measured when you're applying for the visa. So it's intent when you're at the port of entry, at the U.S. consulate, or filing that paperwork with USCIS. That's when your intent is measured. So you need to be careful if you are in a TN visa interview at the port of entry, for example, and the officer is asking you do not want to say anything that would give that officer the impression that you will be staying in the United States permanently, that you are just moving everything to the United States and setting up shop and never going back to your home country. That is not allowed under TN status. So you need to make sure that at the time of application, that the paperwork, that everything that you're saying lines up with temporary employment in the United States. Now, and we'll hit this a little bit later, intent can change. So at the time of application, it must be non-immigrant. You must be temporary. Can that change later? Yes, absolutely. Intent can change. Intent is fluid. But at the time of the application, absolutely must be temporary. So going to some of the professions that can cause issues at the port of entry, management consultants. I've heard clients and I've heard officers talk about this profession. We used to be able to go to the ports of entry on a regular basis. The Peace Bridge is right outside my window here. We used to be able to represent clients in person at the port of entry until a few years ago. They stopped that practice. And border officers are very skeptical of management consultants, and they'll tell you right to your face, I don't believe there's actually such a thing as a management consultant. We don't approve these. I've heard that said many times. And then they'll review the paperwork if they're doing their job correctly. Sometimes they won't. And then they will determine whether or not they think it's a management consultant. An individual called the other day who went to one of the local ports of entry and turned the individual away, telling them that according to my standard, I don't think you're a management consultant. Then that individual on the exit from the port was escorted out by another officer that said, "Yeah, I don't agree with him. If it were me, I would have approved you." So there's a lot of discretion when it comes to determining whether or not an individual fits in one of these professions. And management consultant is one of them, and it faces a lot of scrutiny. So what is a management consultant? Well, it's typically an independent contractor who's been hired to advise a company on certain things within their organization that will lead to managerial improvements, operational improvements, financial improvements within the organization. They'll look at how things are going currently. Then they will write reports and make recommendations to the management or executive team of the organization. The executive team will then decide what recommendations from that consultant they want to implement. And they're usually independent contractors, unless you're working for a consulting firm who actually employs consultants. So I guess the easiest ones, the ones that come to mind would be like KPMG or Deloitte. Well, they're consulting companies. They are consultants all the time. So if you're working for a consulting company, then in those situations, you're typically an employee. Otherwise, if you're an independent consultant, you are not typically an employee of the organization. You do not have a role within the company. You do not have direct reports. You don't manage employees. You do not report to anybody. You don't have a daily schedule. They don't assign you tasks to do. You simply analyze, advise, and provide reports and recommendations. So, management consultant, you have to be careful. Those, even if you are a legitimate consultant, you will face a lot of scrutiny. You need to make sure your paperwork's in order and everything's presented properly. And one word out of order in one of those applications could derail the entire thing. And the other one is a computer systems analyst, and I hit on this briefly. And the reason computer systems analysts can be problematic is people simply don't understand how to qualify. They earn their degree outside of North America, and then they want to use that degree to qualify as a computer systems analyst. And we see this a lot with Canadian nationals who were born in India or Pakistan or another country and educated there as well. And now they want to use that experience or education to then get a TN visa because they're now Canadian. So in those instances, if your degree was outside of North America, make sure you get your credentials evaluated for their equivalency to a US degree, and make sure that degree is in fact a computer related degree. And if it is a diploma, it must be again from Canada or the United States. And if it's a certificate from Mexico. So 2-year degree from India, Pakistan, UK, or any country outside of Mexico, Canada, or the US, it does not qualify for computer systems analysts. And reiterating again, you can't combine your education and experience to meet the 4-year degree requirement. It's just not allowed for a TN visa. Another thing to note for a computer systems analyst is the position can only include up to 10% programming. So if you're exceeding 10% in programming your duties, they've determined that is not a computer systems analyst. You may be a better fit for a computer engineer in that regard. And that can be problematic because a lot of those individuals don't have an engineering related degree or license. So that's why they're trying computer systems analysts. And you see that a lot. Someone doesn't qualify, so they try to squeak in to another profession and try to argue that their education or experience qualifies them. These boxes aren't very flexible. If you don't fit in that box, it's going to be very hard to convince a border officer that you do. One of the last professions that can be difficult is scientific technician, technologist. Now, this one has a lot of added requirements that the other professions don't. And if you don't pay attention to what the requirements are under a scientific technician, technologist, you can get denied very easily. Now, in this role, you must work in direct support of a professional in one of the following designated fields: either agricultural sciences, astronomy, biology, chemistry, engineering, forestry, geology, geophysics, meteorology, or physics. Those professions alone. And what is a professional in one of those areas? Well, a professional is an individual who has either a license or degree in that field. So that individual must have their own licensure or education in that field. And you must be reporting directly to that individual. And as the applicant, you must be able to demonstrate that you have the ability to solve problems in that field. And that one's a little bit more fluid on how that is determined. But you would show that through the duties and how your duties are interrelated with those of your supervisor. And you should have at least 2 years of experience or a degree in the field. And I'll tell you right now that the border prefers a degree. If you don't have a degree, good luck getting approved at a border. Now, USCIS is a different story. Why? Good question. Because the regulations don't explicitly state you have to have a degree in the field. It states that you can qualify on experience. But the Port of Entry does not like to approve people without a degree. And you cannot work in the construction trades again as a scientific technician, technologist. So the exclusion of the trades also applies here. No mechanics, welders, electricians, carpenters, etc. All right, so what does the application process look like? Well, it varies. It's different if you're Canadian or Mexican. So if you're Canadian, the first thing you have to have a job offer, and I said that previously. You can't apply until you actually have that contract or job offer in hand. Get all your supporting documents together. Well, what does that look like? That should include your original diplomas, certificates, and proof of qualifications. An ink signed support letter. No digital or electronic signatures are acceptable. And the application itself, if you're Canadian, there are a couple different options because Canadians are what are called visa exempt. They do not need a visa prior to seeking entry to the United States. And if you're Canadian, you know what we're talking about. You just show up at the border with your passport and you seek entry to the United States. That also applies for a TN. So you do not need to go to a US consulate to get a TN visa before seeking entry to the United States. You apply directly at a port of entry or through designated pre-flight inspection points at airports. And that's the fastest and cheapest way to get a TN. If you're Canadian, just show up with the right paperwork and your valid passport at pre-flight inspection or port of entry, and they'll adjudicate it right there on the spot. And some ports require appointments. I know all the Buffalo ports do, and we're hearing that other ports are starting to require appointments. So that would mean you have to call ahead of time and schedule a time slot for your TN visa application. If you're doing pre-flight inspection, those are 24/7. So you show up. The requirement there, however, is you have to have a ticket. So you can't go to an airport and go to pre-flight inspection unless you actually have a ticket for a flight. And it must be the day of the flight for you to be able to apply a pre-flight inspection. You also, if you're Canadian, have the other option to apply by mail with USCIS for what we call pre-approval. That takes a lot longer, and there are filing fees with USCIS that you have to take into consideration. Their standard processing is about 3 months. Premium processing, they tell you 15 business days. If they do what's called a request for evidence, that 15 business days can turn into 30 to 45 real fast. And premium processing alone is an additional fee of $2,800. So it's much more expensive if you opt the USCIS route. But depending on your situation, maybe you've applied at a port of entry and you've been refused. Well, we might recommend going through USCIS for a second opinion because it might be your only option to get a TN. But if it's an initial, you have all your paperwork together, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to go to a port of entry or pre-flight inspection. In any event, there's going to be an interview at the border, whether you get approved with USCIS or you're presenting the first time at the border. The border officer has ultimate discretion to admit you in TN status. If you're presenting it for the first time, they will do a thorough review and they'll ask you questions about your application materials, the job you're going to perform in the United States, your qualifications, and they will determine whether or not to issue that TN status to you. If you're going with a pre-approval from USCIS, typically they're going to defer to that approval from USCIS, and they could just ask you a few simple questions before admitting you. They could, if they choose, however, re-adjudicate the entire case right there if they decide it's necessary. Now, once you are approved, CBP will issue what is called an I-94 emission record. This is actual proof of your authorization to work in the United States. And many people are confuse this I-94 with a visa. A visa simply allows you to seek admission to the US. And in this case, as a Canadian, you don't need that. You just use your passport. The official record of your status is this I-94 admission record, and they've gone electronic. You can pull that I-94 admission record with your passport after you've been admitted to the United States. And then it will indicate the date you've been approved to start working. It'll indicate when that status ends, and it'll indicate your status. It should say TN status. Sometimes border officers make errors and they will admit you as a visitor instead. So if you have applied, make sure you pull up your I-94 admission record and verify that you were admitted properly for the proper time frame. And if not, then you should seek to get a correction immediately. And pay attention to when it expires, because that's your responsibility to make sure that you are in the United States in valid status and that you don't overstay. And that I-94 record will then be used to then obtain a US Social Security number if you don't already have one. If you do have one, you don't get another one. Once you have a valid visa, it reauthorizes the use of that Social Security number. But if you don't have one or haven't been issued one, you can now get one with that I-94. And it typically takes about 10 days for the border to share those records with the Social Security office. So give it a few days if you've applied for a TN and need to get a Social Security number before you go to the Social Security office, because you have to wait for them to share that admission record with them before they'll issue that Social Security number. If you're a Mexican citizen, we'll just go into the different process for them. Mexicans can't apply directly at a port of entry or pre-flight inspection. They have to get a visa. They are not visa exempt like Canadians. So once you have all your paperwork in order, they actually have to complete what's called a DS-160 with their local consulate or embassy, book an appointment for an interview, do biometrics appointment, attend the interview. Then at the end of the interview, they will determine whether or not they want to issue the visa. Then they will collect the passport. If approved, they'll put the actual visa foil, is what we call it, in that passport, and then it will be returned to them. Then that TN visa in their passport would be used to present at a port of entry to then seek entry to the United States under that TN visa. And then if they are admitted by CBP, it's the same process as a Canadian. They would then issue an I-94 record of admission. And then that I-94 record of admission would be used to then obtain a US Social Security number. That's a huge difference for Mexicans. They have to go through the effort of going to a consulate, obtaining that visa before they can seek entry. And that's if they're not already in the United States. If they don't have a visa to travel to the US, they have to first go to a consulate, get that visa before they can enter in TN status, or on that TN visa and obtain TN status in the United States. If, however, a Mexican citizen is already in the United States, let's say they're here as a student or they're here as a visitor, and they want to change their status while inside the United States to a TN, that does not require them to leave the US to go to a consulate and re-enter. They could simply file by mail with USCIS to change their status over to TN status without the need of departing the United States. So different process for Mexicans. It's a longer process. We just had a Mexican client schedule their interview. I can't remember I think their interview's for September, if I can remember correctly. We also had another one who got an interview within a week. So it depends on the consulate. It depends on availability of appointments. But for a Mexican citizen who doesn't already have a visa, it can take a few more months for them to enter the United States, because they have to, unfortunately, go to a consulate or embassy and get a visa prior to coming to the United States. So some common challenges that we see with TN visas, and we've talked about some of these already, job classification issues. So making sure that your job fits under a USMCA profession. And I'll go back to the job title issue that I talked about earlier. Companies have all sorts of job titles. I call people all sorts of crazy things. You name it, we've seen it. Sometimes it can be difficult to identify what the profession is if that job title is some nuanced job title within an organization. When we do TN applications, and it's our advice, when you do a TN application, line up whatever your internal job title is with the profession. You are not applying for a job at the border. You're not applying for that job. You're applying for a visa, and you're applying for a visa under a visa profession. So make it clear to the border officer which profession you are applying under. So you don't leave that up to their discretion to determine. If you leave it up to the officer's discretion, you're in trouble. And a lot of times they'll turn you away. If it's not easy for them to identify what occupation you're applying under, they'll simply refuse you and tell you to come back with better paperwork. Or worst case scenario, they'll just deny you. Errors in documentation, we see this a lot as well. Someone will go to the border and they won't have a time period listed under their paperwork. It'll say a start date, but it doesn't say an end date. Or it talks in general, and you see this a lot, they'll have this massive paragraph that talks about the position, but it doesn't really talk about what the individual will be doing on a daily basis. The simplest way to lay that out, put your duties in bullet point format so an officer can easily see what's in there. Also, lengthy support letters or offer letters where they go on for pages talking about how important the employee is or how important the company is. Officers don't care. They're going to read that. They're going to read it. They're going to put as little effort as they possibly can into these applications. So making it as easy as possible for officer to identify what they need to approve these applications is essential, and making sure those documents are correct. Qualification mismatches, again, they're very strict on the education requirements. If you don't meet them, if you have a degree in English and you are arguing that you're a computer systems analyst, they're not going to approve you. That's too big of a stretch. It's not even closely related. Renewal is not guaranteed. Just because you're approved for TN in the past doesn't mean that they're going to approve you in the future. It's not automatic. Even if it's the same employer, even if you've had, we just had a client who went for, oh gosh, I think it was his fifth extension for the same employer, and they gave him a hard time. It wasn't a rubber stamp, and some people think it's going to be a rubber stamp just because it's, hey, you've approved me in the past. Hey, I'm an engineer. Hey, my company. Well, a new officer is going to re-adjudicate that, and they're going to expect that evidence, everything from scratch, perfectly done, or else they won't approve you. And actually, I think they take it as a badge of honor if they deny somebody who's been approved in the past. So make sure you're prepared. Intent to return. Again, TN, non-immigrant. If you go to the border and you say, hey, I'm getting my TN, but my spouse or my fiance is in the United States, my fiance is a US citizen, I'm going to marry them and get a green card. No, you're not. The border will turn you around and tell you to then apply for the proper immigrant visa if you plan on doing that. However, if you show up and you get a TN and then later on you change your mind and you get married and then you file for the green card, then you're not going to have an issue. So there, it's about making sure you strategize that properly. If you're expressing the wrong intent when you're applying for your TN, you're going to likely be refused. So make sure your intent is always temporary and not permanent when you're coming to apply for TN visa. So how do you have a successful application for TN? Make sure your job title is a match or close, or at a minimum indicates that, hey, our internal title of XYZ falls under the USMCA profession of engineer. So make sure there's a clear match, or you tie it together nice and neat for the officer. Make sure you have all your documentation in order, valid passport, your offer letter that includes all the necessary requirements. And something people miss on those offer letters, I failed to mention, is it has to be addressed to the border. It can't be addressed to you as an individual. So simple things like that can mean your documentation isn't complete. Make sure you carry all those original proof of your degrees and licenses with you as well. And make sure your education lines up with that TN occupation, and that if you have any foreign degree evaluations that are needed, that those are included as well. And you can line that up with that profession. And more importantly, that the border officer can make that easy connection. And make sure you clearly demonstrate through your paperwork and everything that you say that you are coming temporarily to the United States. And I hit on this previously too, any documentation that you have needs to be consistent So if you have a resume that says that you're vice president of sales, but then you're applying as a management consultant, well, that's not very consistent, and it can lead to a denial of an application if they see that there's conflicting information in your documentation. So make sure anything you're carrying with you, or anything that you're presenting, or anything that you have online about you lines up with what you're saying, and a border officer doesn't catch you in it. So that covers TN status at a high level, provides information about the TN for both Canadians and Mexicans. We have these standard Q&As here, these 10 standard questions that we hear a lot. However, if there is somebody that is with us that has a question, you can drop that in the chat, and we'd be glad to answer any specific questions for you. If you don't, then what we're going to do is we're going to cover these FAQs for the TN. So how long can you stay in the U.S. on a TN visa? Well, it can be issued for anywhere from 1 day to 3 years, and it's renewable indefinitely. So as long as you can indicate that you have professional level employment, that you continue to qualify, and that your intent is temporary, you can keep extending that TN. Can you renew a TN? Absolutely. Now, the process varies whether you're Canadian or Mexican. Canadians can simply leave the US and come back in and reapply like they did the first time at a border. They could also file by mail with USCIS for an extension without having to leave the United States. Mexicans, if you're in the United States, would get an extension by filing with USCIS. There are limited situations where they can go to a port of entry if they do have a valid TN visa in their passport as well. Yes, family members can accompany you if you're in the United States under TN status. They would get what's called TD status. Now, TD status allows them to work or to live in the United States with you, but it does not allow them to work. It does, however, allow them to go to school. So if you have children, spouse to go to school, well, they can do that under TD status. However, they cannot work. What happens if your TN application is denied? Good question. It depends. And I know that's not the answer anyone wants to hear, but it does depend. It depends on the reasons the border officer gives for denial, or USCIS, or the consulate for that matter. In situations where you have presented incorrect documentation, or documentation errors, or you fail to present certain pieces of evidence that would show that you qualify, or it's a border officer simply exercising incorrect discretion and denying and saying you don't qualify when, however, you do qualify based on the paperwork, then in those situations, you might be able to file by mail with USCIS for a second opinion. And if USCIS approves it, then you can take that approval to a port of entry and then seek admission under that. So in certain situations, if it's denied, depending on the reason, then there could be remedies to either reapply at a port of entry again, or to file by mail with USCIS. Can you switch employers? Yes and no. So a TN is employer specific. So if you came in to work for Carmex today and you got a TN just for them, well, you can't just go work for another employer because that TN is valid for 3 years. It only authorizes you to work for them. If you got a job offer for another company in the United States, you would have to get a new TN specific to that employer before you start working for them. And it must be approved before you start working for the new employer. So can you switch employers? Yes, you just have to go through the application process and get a new TN before you do that. Are there travel restrictions with the TN? No, you can travel. It's a multiple entry visa. It allows you to go outside, inside and outside of the United States as much or as little as needed. Now, although it is a multiple entry visa, if you're outside of the United States for extended periods of time, they can question whether or not you are maintaining your TN visa or your employment in the United States. And they could ask for proof that you're still working in the US as an engineer or whatever it is, because you've spent so much time outside of the United States. So you can travel as much as you want, but keep in mind, if you're spending excessive amounts of time outside of the US, they can question whether or not you're maintaining that TN. How long does it take to get a TN? Well, if you're Canadian, it's real fast. You get a pre-flight inspection order or border. Once you have the paperwork in order, and typically less than 30 minutes, the process is completed. If you're Mexican, like I stated previously, it could take a couple of months depending on consular interview times. So it really depends on what your citizenship is and how you are applying. If you're doing it with USCIS and you're doing standard processing, again, it could be a couple months. What's the difference between a TN and an H-1B visa? The biggest differences between the two, well, TN is only for Mexicans and Canadians. H-1B visa, available to citizens throughout the world. H-1B visa, limited by a cap. They only have 85,000 available a year. TN visa, unlimited. H-1B visa, subject to a lottery. You have to win the lottery. You really do in order to get an H-1B visa. TN visa, there's no limit. And there's no lottery to get those. H-1B visa also requires working with the Department of Labor. You actually have to get your wage certified and make attestations to the Department of Labor. And the application process has to be done through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. TN visa does not have the same attestation requirements, nor does it require approval from the Department of Labor. So biggest differences there are unlimited availability, ease of application, and no sponsorship requirement through the Department of Labor either. Can a TN visa holder apply for a green card? The infamous question. Yes, they can. It depends. They can apply for a green card either through family sponsorship or employer sponsorship. Actually, the process to go from a TN visa to a green card is exactly the same as the process to go from an H-1B visa to a green card. So TN visa holder gets married to a U.S. citizen, a U.S. permanent resident, and they want to be sponsored by their spouse. Absolutely. Or maybe they have a U.S. citizen, mother or father or adult child, whatever it may be. Absolutely. They can sponsor them. Employer wants to do the perm process. Sure. TN visa holder wants to do an NIW for national interest waiver or extraordinary ability EB-1A. Absolutely. Those are all available. As there are some considerations when it does come to travel because of the intent issues of a TN, but you can absolutely go from a TN visa to a green card if it's done correctly. What are the common reasons for TN visa denial? I would say there are the three most common we see. Number one, you're just not qualified. Very common. People think that I'm qualified, I'm going to go apply for a TN, and they get upset. They present their case to us, and within seconds, I can say, well, you applied as a computer systems analyst and you have a degree in philosophy. You don't qualify. Sorry. You just don't qualify for TN status. Happens a lot. So again, make sure the occupation you are applying for, you actually qualify for it, that you actually have the education, certificates, licensure, or experience that's required for that before you apply. Second, incomplete or incorrect paperwork. Happens all the time. They go with just an offer letter. That's probably the most common error we see. Offer letters are meant for an employee to accept a job offer, and that's it. Those are not written for TN or visa purposes. If you show up to a port of entry with just an offer letter, that's just a quick and easy denial for a border officer. So make sure that that paperwork is complete. I'd say the third reason is just bad advice, whether bad advice from your employer or bad advice from legal counsel saying that you qualify when you just don't qualify, or giving you advice that gets you into trouble when applying for TN status. So make sure you actually qualify, make sure your paperwork is in order, and make sure that you're receiving competent advice before you apply for TN status. Well, hopefully this was able to provide you some clarity for TN status under the USMCA for both Canadians and Mexicans. If you have any other questions about TN status, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you for tuning in today, and we hope you have a great day.